All right, Dan, I think we're good.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Dan Bates, President and CEO, Greater Hamilton Chamber of Commerce, and we are thrilled that you joined us this morning for Coffee and Conversations. We are going to be hearing from Superintendent Andrea Blevins in just a few moments, and she's going to be explaining the difficult strategies and structure of educational funding in the state of Ohio. So stay tuned for that. We are really anxious to hear what all she has to say. And if you have been reading about schools having to adjust their numbers moving forward, then I don't know what you're paying attention to, but anyway, because it's been all over the news. So, Andrea's from Hamilton. This is not a Hamilton issue; it's a state issue. But she has met with everybody, done a lot of research, and actually recognized as kind of like the local expert on how educational funding works in the state of Ohio. So, you know who our speaker is going to be. You know who I am. We're going to do self-introductions. Let me tell you a little bit of protocol. This is a Zoom meeting. If you have any questions, I'm sure that Andrea won't mind if you interrupt her to ask those questions. If you're on Facebook Live, type those questions in, and Laura or Tiffany will answer those questions for you. So with that being said, we're turning it over to Tiffany so we find out who all is on the call today.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Tiffany Grubb, Director of Marketing at the Greater Hamilton Chamber. I'm going to go around my screen. If you introduce yourself, tell us what your name is and what company you're representing today. And we will start with Katie.
Night, and I am with Butler County Regional Transit Authority.
All right, Mike.
I'm with Loring Associates. We're an industrial marketing company. Been around since 1938. Moved up here probably about 2 years ago. Well, 6 years ago.
Awesome. Nancy.
Morning, I'm Nancy O'Neill with the Greater Hamilton Chamber.
Benjamin.
Benjamin McCall, Focus Consulting, Human Resources, Organizational Development, and all the things about HR that you love versus the things that you don't.
Patricia.
Patricia Nance in Monroe, Field-Worthy Photography.
Yaya.
Yaya Doso, Wisconsin Clearing LLC.
Cindy.
Hi, I'm Cindy Keitel with Keitel Business Coaching, and I help you level up so you can put more cash in your pocket.
Jason.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Jason Michael Miller, Director of Membership and Engagement with the Greater Hamilton Chamber.
Laura, did you introduce yourself?
I did not. Good morning, everyone. Laura Merrill with the Greater Hamilton Chamber.
All right, I think that is everybody, although we have two more people. Hang on one second. We have, let's see, Sandy, do you want to introduce yourself and tell us what company you're with?
Can you hear me? Not sure I'm in yet.
Yep.
Sandy Kusnoff with Frank's Glass.
All right, and Cinnamon? All right, maybe she's still trying to join audio. Okay, we can go ahead and get started.
Right. Well, good morning, everyone. I want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak to you today. Dan, I don't know how much of an expert I am in the area, but we are definitely wading through this here in Hamilton. So I appreciate the opportunity to talk about school funding. As Dan mentioned, I'm the proud superintendent here in Hamilton City Schools. This is my first year as superintendent here, though I've been in the district for the last 7 years with over 24 years in education throughout Butler County. So all of my educational teaching and leadership experience has been supporting multiple school districts here in the county. A little bit of everything: rural, being Edgewood City Schools; Middletown, a little more urban and similar to Hamilton in some regards; and then Lakota, which was my previous district before coming here to Hamilton. So I have unique perspectives that represent many of the communities that you are here today from. So I'm excited to be here. As Dan talked about, my goal today is to talk about school funding. There have been massive changes to school funding in the last 6 months to a year, though some of these situations have started, before that. The big piece that we're going to talk about today are the two biggest buckets that affect most school districts in the state, which are local and state funding, and we'll kind of talk through those. As I think Tiffany mentioned, if anyone has any questions, please just interrupt at any time. And I want to make sure that we're answering them when it's pertinent. Then at the end, there is an opportunity for just open discussion and questions as we go through here. So we're going to go ahead and get started. First thing I have here is a lot of people don't realize how schools are funded here in the state. There are actually 4 buckets of funding that make up how school districts are financed. The first bucket is state funding. We're going to talk a lot about state funding today. Inside that bucket is the Fair School Funding Plan, which is what we operate under right now. Something called DPIA, which are extra dollars that are given towards districts that have large populations of students that are economically disadvantaged. Special education funding, career tech funding, and transportation. All of those pieces go into that bucket of state funding. The second bucket that we'll talk about a lot today is local funding. Inside that bucket, that is your property taxes. That is if a community has income taxes, that will be inside of that bucket. It is important to note that in Hamilton, the city has an income tax, but our school district does not. So when we're talking today, this is exclusively about the school side of funding in these buckets. Also within our local funding, you'll see there's emergency and operating levies, as well as bond issues, which are issued to build buildings, and we'll talk about that. All of the funding in that bucket are controlled by local voters, other than districts that are on the 20 mil floor, which we will talk about today. The third bucket of funding that we won't spend a ton of time today, because for most districts in the state, it's only about 5% of their funding. 5 to 10% is average, is the federal Department of Education funding bucket, and that is for restricted dollars for specific programs. It cannot be used for general operating expenses, and so those dollars are earmarked for very specific reasons. And then the last bucket that each district has is other revenue. This might be interest and investments that we make. This might be other one-offs if there's some districts have endowments or different pieces. So it's also a very small bucket of dollars. The two biggest are going to be 1 and 2, which are your state and local dollars. The way that the state funds school districts is it's an equation. Every single school district of the 611 in the state of Ohio have a different percentage of each part of this funding formula. Each bucket, if you will, is weighted different. On state average, you can see here right now, actually, this is one of the first times in the nation where the local taxpayers are footing the bigger bill of public schools in Ohio than in years past. So right now, if you were to take an average across the state, 44% of school funding comes from local tax dollars, 39.4 comes from state, 9% from federal, and then 7.5 from others. While I think it's important, I'm going to go through Hamilton's numbers here. If I put up the image of Butler County school districts here, our 10 counties or 10 school districts in our county, I think it's important to note that every single community has a different formula. So even communities that butt up against each other or look the same on paper, they have all different inputs of what percentage of the budget each bucket funds for us. Any questions there just on state overview? Okay. Let's talk a little bit about Hamilton specifically. So in Hamilton's budget, you will see here that only 17.7% of our budget actually comes from local property tax values. We'll talk more about that here. We are majorly reliant on the state. Almost 66% of our budget comes from the state funding. You can see for us, that's about $88 million a year. So when we talk about changes today that are happening on the state funding bucket, for districts that are more reliant on state dollars, they're going to feel that impact immediately. On the federal side, we actually are higher than the state average. 12.1% of our funding comes from the federal government, and then 4.5% is from our those investments, interests, etc. I put just some stats here over to the side, which I think are important to mention. We receive, as I mentioned, so much more state funding than average. We also actually tax our community lower than even what the state requirement is, and we'll talk more about that later. Basically, this graph shows our district does not follow the state norm. We are more reliant on state dollars than we are on local dollars, and we're much more dependent on what happens at the state and federal government. So let's talk about how we got here, and I'm not going to read each of these. Public schools in Ohio have been funded in many different ways, and there have been challenges over the years of how the state has chosen to handle its state funding. And so there's a few court cases that are on here that I think is really important to talk about. The first one here is in 1911, was the first time that the state required local communities to start contributing towards funding for local schools. That's when property taxes started to go in. We had to use levies in order to access local dollars to meet our budget needs. You can see other pieces here that we have really battled the question in the state of Ohio of how do we make sure that all public schools have equitable access to funds? And it's not dependent if a community can raise dollars or not. And so you'll see in 1923, there was a court case that said we have to make sure the state has to fund schools to make sure that they have all basic needs. For many years, we have toyed with property taxes of, making sure that the community is able to weigh in on whether property taxes go up and all of those pieces. In 1932, you'll see that Ohio actually removed property taxes as part of the state budget, and instead, your local property taxes only fund your local entities, which we'll talk about later. Instead, the state did put an income tax in there in 1932. In 1976, they froze. Up until that point, when property values were reassessed, all school districts would see that growth every single time. However, in 1976, House Bill 920 put a bill in place that said, in order for districts to get any inflationary growth on money, they have to go back to the polls. And we'll talk about that here in a bit. The big one was in 1997 for school funding. That is the DeRolf case. I'm sure that people have talked about this. At that point, it was ruled that the way that Ohio is funding our schools was voted unconstitutional by the Ohio Supreme Court. It is important to notice that because that ruling of that the way that Ohio funds public schools is unconstitutional has been upheld 3 times since that 1997 case. And since that case, the state has been working on lots of different solutions to try to meet that. In the 1997 court ruling, they were given 38 years to fix the issue. 38 years to fix the way that Ohio schools are funded. In 2021, the current legislation that's in place is the introduction of the Fair School Funding Formula. And this was a bipartisan bill that was implemented to try to really attack the unconstitutionalness of the funding system by making sure that every community had equitable access to funds to ensure that all school districts were quality, and it was not based on what could be raised locally. We're going to talk about the Fair School Funding Formula here in a minute and the changes with that, but that is kind of an overview of what happened. When we get to 2025, you're going to see that the changes that happened going into year 5 of this formula made massive changes that took money away from public schools. So for school districts that are more reliant on state dollars, the law that was voted in this past summer, the bill that we will talk about, took away, for instance, in Hamilton, it took away $5 million for us just this school year. And that only gets bigger and bigger as we go forward. Tiffany or Laura, if anyone's dropping questions in as we're going, please just let me know. I'm looking at my screen, so I can't see anything else as we're going through here.
I don't see any currently.
Perfect. As we talked about the history of education, I think what's really important to mention is this is just a historic look at the last 50 years of what percent of the state budget has gone towards public schools. So if you look back in 1975, almost 40% of the overall state spending went to public schools. Today in FY26, we are down to 20%. So I think that's really important because while dollars might go up, the percentage of the budget going towards supporting public schools has seen it's really been cut in half over the years, and it has created a lot of financial difficulties across the state. Let's talk about how funding works. Funding is a 2-year cycle. So the Ohio passes a new budget every 2 years, and that is done on the off-cycle year. So we just passed one this past year. Those funds, where this process starts is we get revenues of what the state has collected in state income. Then the governor drafts his proposal in February and March. From there, it then goes to the House and the Senate to then attack their version. Then in June and July, they come back together to come up with one final budget. And June 30th is when that budget passes. While I think that's so important to bring up is June 30th, we do not know what the funds look like for the next 2 school years that start August 1st. So we have about a 30-day window. And in most cases, we cannot make massive changes in that piece. So this current structure lends itself to, if there's any massive changes to the budget, it is going to be detrimental to the district immediately because you are constantly on a 2-year cycle of funding. I know many of you talked about your business. Just imagine running a $135 billion organization and not knowing that you will have almost 70% of your funds from June 1st to August 1st. And that's really the scenario that we've been put in. Let's talk about the Ohio Fair School Funding Plan started in 2021. And the goal of this plan was to balance and to create a scale, if you will. Depending on how much a local community could raise, the state would then come alongside and make sure that everyone has 100% of the money that they need. So they would come up with what a value is of what it costs to educate a child. They would add all of those other things that I talked about with special ed costs, transportation, etc. They would then balance it of how much is the local community generating through their property taxes, income tax, their local valuations, business dealings, etc. And they would then adjust their portion to make sure that both wealthy communities and districts that are less wealthy have equitable access to dollars. What's really interesting about this formula is it is adjusted every 2 years. So as property values adjust and go up, then that means state dollars go down. It's never a situation where you're getting a windfall of cash one way or the other, because the mechanism is to keep it level so that you're at equal funding based on what it costs to educate a kid in Ohio. When the plan was initiated, the plan was to update inputs of what it costs to educate a child every year. However, after the first year of the formula, they decided to abandon some of that. So the first year that this was implemented was fiscal year 22. The state portion of the budget was 41.6 was funded. They figured out what was the base cost of educating a kid. They looked at the local wealth and they went from there. In their second year of the funding formula, they decided that they were going to go ahead and update everything except any inflationary growth of what it costs to educate a kid. So they kept that the same. So you can see that the state dropped just slightly there. In 2024, they looked at all sides of the equation. One, they looked at, in Butler County specifically, in 2023, we had our last property value reassessment. So property values went up, but they also looked at what was the cost of educating a kid. You can see it in 2024 was the first year that you saw an increase in the amount of state funding of how much states were funding public education. And that was all tied. The formula works when they work it. If they update all parts of the formula, then it will continue to balance out that scale. Where things went haywire is they started abandoning the side that was the state's requirement for the state side of it, of what it costs to educate a child. So you can see in FY25, they did not update. So they kept costs for what it costs to educate a child for FY22. So the state's contribution dropped to 38%. In FY26, they still did not update that, though they updated again the property values side of the equation. It dropped to 35% that the state was funding. And now going into next year, the money that they are spending, because they did not update the base cost to educate a student, is 32.2% of the state budget is now funding public education. I think it's important to show that by comparison, the first year of the formula after the DeRolf case that ruled that the way we fund schools was unconstitutional, the statewide average share of the base cost was 47%. Today, FY25, it was the first time that it was below 40%, and now we are all the way down to 32% of the state budget is going towards just public schools. Yep.
When this last time around where they figured out how much all of our homes and properties were worth, and it seems to be majorly overvalued. Did that reduce the amount of money that Hamilton had as a result of our property values being so high?
Great question. So in Butler County, our last reassessment was in 2023. Okay, they went up by 36%. Property values went up by 36%. And so in that FY24, we would have seen a lower amount of state share because those property values went higher. However, because they looked at the cost that it cost to educate a child, that went up, it kept it level. Where you're talking about is exactly that of what's happened in FY26 and 27. So those property values have stayed high, but they have not adjusted their side of the formula to show what it costs to educate a child in Ohio. So essentially the state is giving us less money, even though there's no new funding of what we're receiving from local property taxes. Does that make
Well,
sense?
and Andrea, go ahead, Mike.
Oh, that was it. Thank you.
Mhm.
Oh, Andrea, and many people, to Mike's point around property taxes and hey, it's all going up. And then some of the language from auditor, from local legislators around, hey, property tax, most of it's your local schools. I think it's important to outline, and you could probably explain this if you're not going to later on. Uh, Depending on the community, like you mentioned, the formula breakdown and that math, some communities actually did not increase in their property taxes, but people feel like they did, and others did not, as well as the share different communities had, like Hamilton, lost, whereas
Correct.
others stayed flat.
And we're going to talk about the property tax side of that,
you would. Go
because
ahead.
there's also legislation, and I think it's important to note, we're talking about the state side of this formula right now. Not only have they changed the laws around what this looks like, we're going to talk about, because they're hearing from so many local community members of how high property taxes are and the spikes and the different things, they've also passed recent legislation that has hit that side of the formula. So you're going to see that here in just a few minutes.
So, Andrea, just to tie in with what Benjamin was saying, there is a perception out there that because of the property tax increase, that the schools all got a windfall that they're sitting on.
And that is not the case. And I think that's why education is so important, of people understanding what these formulas are and what goes into it. There's even caps on what school districts can get, and we're going to get through all that. But Benjamin and Dan, you are 100% correct. As people look at their tax bill and they see my taxes have gone up, they automatically assume schools have received more. In some cases, that's true, but understand when the local community gives you more money, the state takes it away. So it's not that we've gotten this windfall, it's this constant juggling to make sure that your scale is equal. And I don't think a lot of people understand that. They see that and go, what are you complaining about? You just got more property tax money. Well, understand the state just lowers their share. So that is an over-reliance on the local dollars, which was voted unconstitutional years and years ago. All right, great questions. So this is just a slide to kind of show you on the state version of the budget. What really happened this past cycle, as we just talked about, was they plugged in the side of the formula that showed we're bringing in more local dollars. Okay, what they didn't do is show that it costs more to educate a kid in the state of Ohio. Everything costs more: bus fuel, paper, you name it, salaries, etc. They did not update that. So what happened is it created a massive imbalance in the scale. So I've got a graphic here that just shows from Hamilton, if they would have continued implementing the fair school funding formula, it was supposed to be a 6-year phase-in. We were told that it was a guarantee that this was going to be, because we had the same governor, that this was going to carry all the way through. We saw a change of, instead of receiving $40 million, we only received 31 overnight. Now, luckily, when conversations start, when I talked about the governor's budget gets rolled out in February and March, we were able to make some adjustments. We're never just standing still waiting to see what happens. We're always, here in Hamilton, we have not asked for new money from our local community since 1997 for operating expenses. We've actually not passed a levy since 1993. We are constantly adjusting. I equate it to driving down the highway. You're not holding your steering wheel straight. You're constantly. So as there's been declining student enrollment, or as we've been able to capture costs, we have been. So the feeling of what we were able to do because of that less than almost $10 million is we were able to cut enough to where we were only deficit spending, where we started this school year, we were deficit spending by almost $5 million because of this latest implementation of the state budget alone. We're going to talk about the property tax reform here in a minute. But we lost $5 million from the state side for exactly what, Mike, you were mentioning. As the property values were reassessed, the state took that money away. You're going to see here, though, that's just on paper, because they've also passed recent legislation to take away that property tax money as well. So we'll talk about that here in a minute. Well, you can see what that does to us is it destabilized our very stable budget. This year, we are, like I said, are projected to deficit spend by almost $5 million. I'm going to go back to the timing of when this came out was this summer. We couldn't make changes. There are contractual pieces after July 10th. Staff members can't be laid off. There are all kinds of different components. And that is why districts keep a cash balance so that they can manage, change that happens every 2 years. But you can see what happens is the continuing of this forecast. Next year, we are projected to deficit spend by almost $10 million. The following 2 years are a guess. Because that biennium budget, we are not sure what there will be a new governor in Ohio, what the new governor will set the stage for that budget. But if they were to keep everything the same, you can see what continues to happen to where eventually the district bleeds out of cash and doesn't even have any savings there. Okay. A lot of people ask me this question. Why? Why did the state abandon its implementation of the plan that it created? What we hear so often from the state is that it cannot continue to fully fund the formula. Basically, the formula is too expensive. We can't update base costs every year. We can't do these pieces. However, the really hard part for public schools is that the dollars that were needed to fund years 5 and 6 of the formula are the exact same amount of dollars that were given to the voucher program in Ohio. And so a lot of people say, are all of these problems caused by vouchers? The answer is no. However, when the state tells us that the dollars, they don't have the money to fund it, and the same dollars that it would take to fund the formula are on another line item, that's where you're seeing those conclusions drawn. Okay, so let's talk about vouchers just for a minute. Okay, vouchers are not new to the state of Ohio. However, access and who is eligible to apply is what has created this boom in the voucher program across the state. So if you look here, I've got just a little bit of history here. We have 5 different voucher programs in Ohio. The first, when vouchers first started, they served, the first 2 are very specific purposes. The first one was the Cleveland Promise. This was to help students, and this is what you hear all the time. It's to help students that attend a failing school district to have access to funds to choose a better option. For instance, if their child is gifted in a particular performing arts, the family can't afford to send them to a private performing arts school, the state would allow that family to apply, given that their school was failing, given that they met income eligibilities, and they could then take those dollars to access a scholarship. The second one there is the autism voucher. That is for our students with autism to access the John Peterson Scholarship, is another for special education students to ensure those students are getting the critical care that they need. The 2 that have really changed the game are Ed Choice and Ed Choice Expansion. Ed Choice was started as a performance-based voucher program that if a school district was identified or a school building was identified as failing using achievement and growth metrics, then students at that school could access state dollars to attend a private option. That started in 2007. Okay. I think it's important because there's a lot of conversation saying that school choice just started. It didn't. The change that has happened is around Ed Choice expansion. Okay. Go ahead.
How well scrutinized are these private institutions?
There are no requirements for any of these institutions. So they do not have any accountability measures as far as, fiscal operations, programming, admission, etc. The dollars are just allocated to that particular organization because the family has applied.
Thank you.
Andrea, to that point as well, because you'll hear people say, or some people who send their kids to private or charter schools, which is fine if that's what someone wants to do, but they'll say, hey, we have the same requirements. However, there's no similar requirements, even if there are ones that exist that nobody sees, that public schools are required by law, by enhancement in performance, that private schools do not match, as well as providing the data that we all see, complain, or love around our public schools.
Correct. You're 100% correct. And that's what I think is really important here is there have always been school choice. School choice is not a new program. It's who has access to it. And because it has boomed so much, and I'm going to talk about that here in a minute on this graph, we have seen so many more dollars going to private schools without any of those requirements. There are not requirements around enrollment. There are not requirements around assessment or providing services. There are not around programming requirements of, for instance, Governor DeWine has required that all public schools follow the science of reading or are not allowed to have DEI initiatives in their schools or different things. Private schools can do as they wish in those particular areas. Privates and charters. I think it's important it's not just parochial. I know we think that here in Butler County because we have a number of parochial opportunities, but it's not just, it's any organization outside of the public school system. So when you look at this chart here, I think it's very telling. I mentioned all of those different, the Cleveland and autism participation, they have stayed pretty steady over the years. If you look here, as I talked about, the gray line shows this ed expansion. Okay, do you see that there? In 2023, the state legislature took the rails off, took off the requirements that they have to be a part of a failing school district or they have any income requirements. And so anyone in the state of Ohio could apply and receive those state dollars to go to private schools. So you can see in 2023, those numbers boomed from 23,000 families taking that to 88,000. What's very interesting to note here is 96% of the new families that account for this jump never stepped foot in public schools. They have always been in private or charter schools. And so this change was not that all of a sudden there's this mass exodus in public schools. It's now families that have made that choice to send their children to private school could now access those public dollars. Okay. I know these are very complicated. I'm trying to work through there, but please keep asking questions. I think it's really interesting is those changes in 2023. This is actually the top 5 states in the nation of the amount of money that they spend public dollars on school choice programs. And you can see here, Florida is number 1, Arizona, and we are now number 3. In 2024, we were number 5. So we continue to spend more public dollars on private schools than many of the other states that have a private school or school choice program. It is important to note, not all schools, not all states have a school choice program. Okay, this is being challenged in the state of Ohio. It's actually, there's a lawsuit that many public school districts, Hamilton City Schools is a part of this lawsuit of saying this violates the Constitution that says that the state will only fund one public school system. Now that we've seen so much money and so many more students that are accessing public dollars for this, the argument is made that we are now supporting multiple school systems, which is unconstitutional in our Ohio State Constitution.
Over the past couple decades, I've seen a number of companies that seem to have changed their entire purpose from year to year, and it was around chasing public dollars, finding a way to get a hold of them whenever there's a new gold mine. And I guess one of my primary concerns would be that some of these private schools aren't really up to snuff and were just constructed in order to siphon some of that money.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment that I've heard from a lot of other people. I want to be very clear that there are some great private school options in the community, and no, I think every parent should have a choice. But I think the difference is exactly that. There isn't any accountability to the dollars or to the programming. If you stack Hamilton City Schools and our programming up against any private school, we offer more. We offer a full continuum on all sides. We offer more CCP courses, more AP courses. We offer more special education services, ESL services, you name it, elective opportunities, extracurricular. However, you're seeing that there are more families that have chosen that option for whatever reason, accessing public dollars. And that's where we're starting to feel that squeeze. When the state is telling us they don't have enough to fully fund public schools, then it's hard not to talk about school choice in that same conversation.
Thank you.
So, Andrea, a question, and this, if you're going to cover it, please feel free. But one of my biggest questions, especially when Ed Choice, they started to promote Backpack Bill, which became the expansion in Ed Choice, is with the funding. Okay, the state share versus the impact and the weight that's more on local share. My biggest question is, yeah, the state isn't funding it. Locals are funding it. So where is that excess money going outside of just if there's another place outside of just the vouchers? But if you're going to cover it, feel free to do it that time.
No, that is a great question. We've asked similarly those questions. Obviously our state puts out a budget every 2 years, and their rainy day fund is quite large. They actually have enough to fully fund if they were to drain their reserves, and even then some. So I think that's a very fair question to ask. I don't know everything of where they're going, but you saw in this last bill they gave money to the Brown Stadium. They're funding many different organizations as well, and the response that we get is we're still funding you guys more than you need. Basically, public schools have gotten too big. We can't keep at this. Schools need to cut back. Schools need to do that, or local communities need to fund more.
And the rainy day fund is close to $4 billion now, right?
$4 billion, correct.
Yeah.
So it would have taken about $1.7 billion this year to fully fund year 5 of the Fair School Funding formula. And so $1.7 billion was given to vouchers, but you are right. It's about $4 billion sitting in their rainy day fund. Okay. This is the last little stat that I just think is quite interesting as we kind of make the pivot here from state to local dollars. In 2002, Ohio was ranked 35th nationally in the amount of state funding it gave for K-12 education. By 2023, we have plummeted to 45th. 45th out of 50 states in the nation. We are among the worst of the amount of dollars put into education. I've heard from so many legislators that like to throw out billions of dollars, but when you really look at where we are ratio wise and percentage of budget, it's hard to ignore what's happening across the state. The state share of education, as we talked about, has dropped here from that 44.8 to 33.25 in that same time from 2002 to 23. Meanwhile, in that same period of time, our local property tax burden jumped from that 49 to 53. So you can kind of see here on the graph, the first 2 years of the Fair School Funding formula, this is what the base cost was to educate a kid, roughly $7,000 in the state. You can see what the state share of that was versus the local property tax share. You can see that the second year of that, as I mentioned, because they didn't update base costs in year 2 of the formula, it stayed flat. So the state portion went down because the local was going up. Do you see that kind of on that chart? Then in 2024 was where we had that reassessment of property values here specifically in Butler County. Every county is on a different cycle with that. So you can see the local property share went up, but the state went up at the same time because they increased what it costs to educate a kid. So you can see that that jumped here to about $8,000 a kid. From there, it has been a steady decline in what that looks like. What I think is important to note, the only 2 years that we know for sure right now are 26 and 27. The rest, that's why you see it as a flat line, because we do not know what will happen 28 and beyond. You can see though, in that same period of time, our lines are converging. The local community is carrying a bigger share of that. What's interesting in Hamilton, that's still not the case. We still are more dependent on state funding, which means as the state share goes out, that affects us more adversely than it might for a community that's more dependent on local property dollars. Okay.
So Andrea, I
Yep.
have a question, and
Yep.
this is probably an unfair question to ask you, but I apologize. I'm going to do it anyway. You've met with all the legislators, and I guess I'm wondering what the goal, philosophy, whatever is, because I hear constantly, which, as a chamber president, we're thrilled that, they want to make, Ohio the, business capital of the United States, and, understanding the importance of workforce, component into that, and also the number of students that, come directly from education into the workforce,
Yeah.
with certifications and trainings and things like that. Many of the private schools and charter schools are more college bound focused. Okay. So, and yet at the same time, what I see is that a real support of, technical education and, things where people could be in the workforce right after school or, within a year or two from graduation. I guess I'm like confused here because most of those technical, models that the legislators seem to love are still public education. So, it seems to me, isn't there a direct impact as they, take money away from public education? That's going to impact those models as well because they are still public schools, and all of the other schools are feeder schools into those programs, regardless of, whether you're in Ohio or whatever. That's kind of how all technical schools operate. So I'm just kind of talking out loud here. Like, I'm confused.
Yeah, I think to be fair, I've met with many legislators and I think they're confused as well. I don't think many understand really what goes into the formula. I think there are different specialties of our legislator, and that's been a big piece of mine, is helping to educate just that, Dan. 75% of Hamilton High's graduates go right into the workforce. We do so many things to help prepare our kids with the workforce. I hear often, well, the reason why public schools aren't working is because they cost so much more to educate. These private schools, it doesn't cost them as much to educate. They're not, they don't have all these pieces. Well, they're not providing the same continuum of service we are. They're not educating the same child that we are. We know that children that come from homes of poverty and come with different needs, it costs more to educate. The state has acknowledged that. In addition, we have to be the experts at the full continuum. So we have to hit our top tier that are college bound kids. I'm very proud to say we have National Merit Scholars in Hamilton High School, kids that go on to Harvard and Yale and become extremely productive, middle, higher to middle class productive citizens. However, we also have a full continuum that go right into the workforce. So our scope of what we teach hits all of that. We've been doing career tech since before our local career tech center was on the scene because we saw that was a need. The problem is as dollars dry up, those are the programs that I worry about the most because those are not required by the state of Ohio in the same way that the reading and the writing and the math and the science are. And so that's been my big push, is if we're trying to make Ohio the business capital of the world, then we've got to invest in our public schools. Because if we don't, where are you going to get your workforce? That really is where they're coming out of.
Well, and Andrea, a point, and you can clarify this, is people think about the cost, all the costs that you outlined, the state share, the local share, and the cost it is to provide to public schools. However, there's hidden costs that many people don't talk about is when someone goes to a private school, colloquial, charter, there are still services that are required by law by public schools to provide, whether it be busing, whether it be certain services for disadvantaged children or things like that, that the private school, the colloquial school, the charter schools do not, by law, are not required. So there are hidden costs and added costs that we're still paying for that these other systems, not their fault or their, are not having to take the burden for, that public schools are required by law to do.
Correct. There are so many of those particular pieces, and when they're giving the full base cost of a child to that private institution, then that's automatically going to pass that burden on to your public schools, because we are providing those services. On the federal government side, which we're not going to talk a ton about today, we even have to act as the fiscal agent for those schools. So we have to provide counselors and nurses and all of those things to those private schools, even though they're receiving the full cost, if you will, the full state share of what it costs to educate that kid from the state side of it. So that's coming out of your local property tax dollars, that smaller percent, because that's what the local community is providing. All right, let's move on to local funding, okay? Because you are right, that's the one that gets a lot of attention here in the community. I don't think a lot of people, while the biggest portion of property taxes go to schools, they provide so many additional essential services. So they pay for your fire and your police service, your roads and your infrastructure, your parks and recreation, your libraries. They also go, a portion of your local property taxes go to that career tech center that Mr. Bates spoke about. So they receive, every career tech center for a county receives a certain percentage of your property taxes in your community to help run and do those pieces. Property taxes work to provide so much here. And it goes back to that change on the state law that changed from that the property taxes used to funnel to the state, and now they stay in your local municipality. So people can break down their property taxes and look at that. Here's how property taxes are calculated. I won't go through this too much, but the biggest thing is the school districts nor the city do not determine what those property values are. Every 3 years, our county commissioners and our auditors determine property values, and those are done every 3 or 6 years, depending on whether it's an update or full reappraisal year. 2026 will be a update for us. The reappraisal was in 2023. It then takes, so a lot of people think that whatever your home value, if it's $200,000, that you're paying the property tax on that full $200,000, but that is not accurate. Ohio has a rule that you only pay up to 35% of that particular piece. So I've taken that $200,000 here and showed what you're actually taxed on is that $70,000 as opposed to the full value of that home. So when we talk about inflated costs, it's relative, right? Because if everything goes up by 36%, you'll experience it, but it's not the full value. It would be that raise of that 35%. Then from there, they look at what $1 mil or $1 for every 1,000 of property value in your community look, and that becomes your property bill. So for instance, if 1 mil in Hamilton is worth $1,000, you can see here this property owner would have to pay. They were taxed on $70,000 at 72 mils, so their overall taxes are $5,040. Then from there are credits and exemptions that reduce that bill. Now, what the local millage is, the local value, that is what's plugged into the state formula. So before any reductions are made, that's what the state sees as the value of your local property dollars. So that's already going to adjust the state version of that even and provide less money than what we're actually getting. So within there are some different pieces, a 10% occupancy. If they live in the home, then they get a credit there. There's a 2.5% rollback, and then there's a homestead extension that was added. So you can see here those credits that lowers that bill. The credits reduce what homeowners pay, but we lose that access to that revenue. The state does not reimburse districts for that full value of those credits. So even though they're calculating that we're receiving them, we do not get that made up whole on the other side of the state formula. There is a state law, an Ohio school funding rule that goes back to when they talked about that every community has to help support their local school district, that says that every school district has to be able to collect at least 20 mills. Okay, so 20 mills in a community. Basically, the law says that a community should have to fund a minimum of 20% of its school funding. In communities that when they generate and collect their 20 mills, that does not equal 20% of the operating expenses, they're on something called the 20 mill floor. The 20 mill floor states that until a district reaches that level, any reassessment is the full amount. It's not capped. Typically, when reassessments are done, they adjust your tax rates to make sure that they're not going too high, that taxpayers aren't seeing that overnight piece. However, there is a state rule that if a school district is not generating enough money, then the taxpayers have to eat that full increase. So we talked about in 2023 that 36%. Okay, taxpayers saw a 36% increase because Hamilton City Schools and another 408 of 611 districts are below that 20% funding rule. What that has created is high property taxes, and people feel that. This system has done what the state has asked it to do. Ohioans paid $5.1 billion more in property taxes in 2024 than in 2010. That's 43% higher than inflation. Okay, and it's all established because of those state rules that dictate what that looks like in order to make sure communities are carrying their brunt, or as you saw in some of those charts before, the higher burden of funding their public schools. School district.
Andrea,
Yep, go ahead.
one question. Is there anything in the state constitution that requires particulars around the amount of property tax that can be collected? Because I've heard that, but I haven't really researched the issue as much.
So every school district must collect 20 mills. Okay. Now that does not mean that basically it wants every community to generate 20% of funding. That's what the state says the minimum threshold is. However, based on property wealth, that doesn't mean that always happens. And so until a district gets to that 20% threshold, they are continuing to collect more and more property taxes until they get to that threshold, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
Okay. So that's been the problem. And we're hearing that from local community owners. You know, my taxes continue to go up. How are you not getting more money? Well, it's because as the local property owners provide more, the state funding goes down. Okay. And that's why we've got these converging lines. So they're going, how are you out of money? I'm paying more taxes than I've ever done. And so the very interesting piece that Dan mentioned before of why he's confused, with some of the state legislator is now the state is also saying we need to lower property taxes. And so actually in December, Governor DeWine passed a series of 4 new property tax reform bills that actually community members will start seeing on their second tax bill this year. Okay. The first thing that it did was capped that even if property values go up by 36%, which is not typical. 2023 was an anomaly. However, what it made is that if the property values go up by 36% or anything above, school districts can only see an increase of inflation of 9%. Okay, no big deal. That's going forward. That was the first part of the bill. Districts can plan for that. We actually do not, we do not project massive increases in property taxes year after year. However, the second part of that bill that was really disastrous for school districts that are at that 20 mil floor, so because they're generating less than the 20%, they actually went back to 2023 and made it retroactive. Okay, so they've taken away money from school districts that we were already granted because of those property tax increases. Okay, for Hamilton, that will take between $3.3 and $3.9 million every single year moving forward. Okay, that was just passed in December. In addition, they added some other pieces. One, they adjusted of who's actually on the 20 mil floor. Our district is a traditional 20 mil floor. There are some districts that do substitute or emergency levies because then it doesn't count into their worth. I don't disagree that should have gone into effect. A district needs to be accurate of what its dollars, what it's generating locally. The last thing that it gave was more control to our county commissioners. And so our county commissioners are able to look at what tax rates are and lower them as they see fit. A prime example of that is the homestead credit. So the homestead credit is to our senior citizens and people that live in extreme poverty. They receive a 12% credit on their taxes. The county commissioner just doubled that. Well, that's a good thing for the local community, but that just took 12% more dollars away from public schools. So for us in this calendar year, that's what we don't know. 3.3 is right now. They've done that one time. If it goes to 3.9 is if the commissioner decides to continue renewing that particular credit in years coming forward. And so you're hearing a lot. I do think the state realizes they have a problem, that local community members cannot continue to afford high property taxes. And so they were hoping to pass this property tax reform to provide some relief. But what they're doing is just passing the problem on to now public schools are feeling even more of a crunch. Like I mentioned, I put here, Hamilton's going to lose between 3.3 to 3.9 million. We met with local school districts in our area. We looked at 6 Butler County school districts, and just next year alone, the property tax reform is going to take $16 million from public schools and 6 of those 10 Butler County schools in our area.
So Andrea, I have a question. Is that 3+ million on top of the 4 that you mentioned earlier?
Yep, I'm getting ready to show you what that looks
Okay,
like.
sorry.
No, you're fine.
And Andrea, if any of that's made up by, say, private donors or fundraising or any of that, does that reduce the amount that the district gets from the state?
So yes, the state looks at constantly what are you generating locally. Remember we talked about those 4 buckets that all goes into the formula. So if all of a sudden we have a large endowment or a donation of that, then that will lower that piece because they look at your district's wealth. It's a constant scale. That's the best way any new money that you generate lowers that particular burden. So what happens is communities have to basically leapfrog, right? They have to ask for an exorbitant amount to be able to counteract what they're going to lose on the state side of that, which is what you're seeing happening. Again, this is what it looks like. So in 2 of the 4 pieces, your state and local shares of the bucket have now seen changes that have taken dollars from public schools across the state. Those 611 schools, all dependent on which side of this bucket hits them. And I know I'm kind of glossing over some of this. I could spend 8 hours talking about any one of these topics. But these 2 pieces, the largest 2 funding sources, have been attacked in the last 8 months here in Ohio. So let's talk about what that did for Hamilton. I showed you before, we roughly were almost $5 million in our current year. This is what we are projected to what our fiscal year looks like. Actually, our treasurer will be presenting this tonight because all updated forecasts are due by the end of February. So you can see here our revenue coming in is 117 million, but our expenditures are 122. So we will deficit spend by about $48 million, or I'm sorry, $4.8 million. That will leave our cash reserves with 43 million going into next year. You might say, well, that's a decent cushion. That's not, we're going to talk about number of days on cash. That wouldn't even get us through half of a school year. It's about 1/3 of our typical operating expense. Then if you look at next year, which we know, that's where the full impact, because remember, those property tax reforms are only going to impact half of a year right now. But next year, they will affect the full piece. So you can see here, our revenue coming in dropped by $3 million, so 114. Our expenditures are 126 because everything continues to grow, and expenses, that will then create a $12.3 million deficit spend and take our cash balance to 31 million. And you can kind of see what that does year after year if that continues. What did this do for us? It left us between a rock and a hard place. There are only really 2 big decisions that a district has when faced in this. And you're going to see this happening in districts all throughout the state in the next 24 to 48 months, because like I mentioned, the 2 biggest mechanisms that fund school districts are being attacked on both sides of that formula. So for Hamilton City Schools, the decisions that we had to make were either looking at budget cuts and or going back for a levy. For us right now, we felt that we had the fat on the bone And I say that lightly because everything we do is essential for kids, but we felt that we could get there without going back to taxpayers because we aren't sure what the future of property taxes look like. We aren't sure what the success rate of passing a levy is in Hamilton. Like I mentioned, we have not asked for one since 1997. It was not passed in 1997. The last time that an operational levy passed was 1993 here. So our board and our senior leadership decided that our plan was to cut the deficit spend. We said that we would cut it by $9.7 million. We're doing this because it allows one reshuffle instead of every year having to cut multiple $1 million from a budget. It also, as you'll see here in a graph here in a minute, cutting earlier creates greater savings, right? You stop the bleed earlier. It allows for more stability so that we're not back in this mess in a year. It also keeps our district out of fiscal caution. If we were to file our next forecast, not this one, but next August, our district would be placed in fiscal caution because we had a negative cash balance 2 years out. The number of school districts across the state of Ohio that will be receiving fiscal cautions after their February forecast is frightening. It's really scary of what's happening. It also allows us to keep a higher cash balance going into the next unknown. We have no idea. We have a new governor coming in. Depending on who is elected, that could be good or bad for school districts. And so we decided to make that plan to reduce it. So what I have here is just cash on hand. This is actually from Mr. Frazier's update this evening. So right now, based off of when we filed our last forecast, we had 131 days of cash on hand. This year we have 130. If we did nothing, when I was showing you that chart before, we would have gone down deficit spending and only had 90 days of dollars in reserves. By cutting $9.7 million, we keep our cash balance healthier going into the next budget. So you can see here, we kept that at 121 days of cash, and you can see what that plays out. Though these situations provide some stability for us, it does not get us out of the bigger problem that's happening with how schools are being funded. If things don't change in the next biennium budget in 2028, we will have to go back to the table and figure out either going to our local community to ask for more dollars, to make additional cuts that would be detrimental to kids, or to come up with different economic development deals to try to generate new dollars for our district.
Andrea, you're getting into it now, but for the sentiment from those who say the actions by the state, the changes in the budget, the changes in the legislation that talk about, hey, we're relieving property tax and all these things and the impact to local schools. When it comes to the sentiment around people saying, well, hey, you have to manage your budgets more. You have to be able to I know you're talking about that, but what is some of your answer to those who say that's simply what you can do, knowing that no matter what you do, money is being taken away, so.
I think the thing is, we can manage our budget when we know it long term. When it changes from June to August, that's an overnight piece. And what I say to those people is we are doing that. Instead of going back and asking for additional funds, we are cutting $9.7 million. And so that's hard for me when I hear people who will say, well, they should manage their budget better. This is a leadership problem. This is, all these different pieces. These changes happened in the summer. This past summer, these changes happened. The property tax reform happened in December, taking an additional $3.3 to $3.9 million. These are of no fault of our district. However, our district did take the hard stance of we cannot pass that burden on to a community that's already struggling to pay the tax rates that they are. And so our district made the hard choice to look internally. And we cut $9.7 million in budget, in our budget spending for next year. That will create a longer runway for us to figure out what the long-term solutions are. And the crazy part is I listed all the different pieces that we're doing here. We were able to do what we're doing. We're changing our footprint. We're closing one elementary school. We're combining our 9-12 high school, but we are not losing any programming. We are not raising class sizes. We are not raising pay to play or extracurricular fees or getting rid of opportunities for kids because we need quality programs for our students and for our school district. We are in a place where we were able to get there this time. When I look at other communities in our area who are facing this same, the Fairfield is right now going for a levy. They did not have a lane to be able to make these types of cuts. This is the first time Hamilton has had to look at these things in this way. And it is because of the changes on both sides of the formula that have really been detrimental to us. We could continue to deficit spend for a number of years and run through our cash balance, but I don't think that's being a good fiscal steward of our dollars here in this community, nor is that doing everything in our power to make sure we're continuing to put out a great product for our kids. The last slide that I kind of put here, and then I'll open it up to questions, is, why does this matter? Why does this matter to the business community? One, I have to put my plug here that I believe public education is the American dream. It is the ability for any kid, no matter what type of background or challenges they have, to come and be whoever they want. I am sitting here today because of public education. I am a first-generation college student. My mom got pregnant with me very young. My family has seen itself of trauma, but I went to school and they taught me and they said, you can be anything. You've got aptitude, and they provided those outlets for me. And that's what public schools are. But why does this matter beyond to people who don't have kids in school, or people who, aren't worried about that? They can create those opportunities for their kids on their own. One, a highly effective school district drives up property values. The number one, piece when we talk with both our city partners as well as local realtors is, give me a good school district and I will sell 1 million houses. The better the school district, that's the first question that I hear is, how good are your schools? And so that's a very important piece of it. As Dan mentioned early, workforce development, that is a massive driver of what we do. Over 75% of the kids that graduate from Hamilton High School go right into our workforce. If we have to cut programs, if we have to cut opportunities for kids, that only hurts everything the state is trying to do with making it the business capital of the world. And then the last one is community stability. Our schools are more than just, the place where kids go to learn. It's the place where kids often we provide free meals for breakfast and lunch to 100% of our students. We're the meeting place. We're the sports teams. We're the mental health supports that are there, or the counseling. We do so much beyond just the education of kids each and every day. And public education has to continue. In the state of Ohio, for all those numbers that I showed you about vouchers and private schools, still to this day, 90% of kids across the state attend public schools. We have to keep public schools strong. And so these changes are detrimental, and they only change when people understand what's happening and help to advocate for change. I'd love to see the people that, want lower property taxes to help unite with schools and say, state, you got to fix this. The local community owners can't afford to the shift that's happening and the burden, but at the same time, we've got to have highly functioning schools that have the funds to do what they need to do. And so I'm gonna, I just want to thank you guys for, allowing me to speak and talk about this, but also I'll just open it up if there's any questions or comments.
Andrea, I have a couple questions. If I've been paying attention, I think I have. So basically, even if a district passes a levy, that could actually backfire because it actually reduces the amount of funding they're going to get from the state. So the levy has to be so huge to counteract that it becomes something that nobody's going to agree to. Am I reading that correctly?
You are correct. Now, right now, we already know what funding looks like for next year. So it's off those 2-year cycles. So for instance, you'll see a lot of districts that are going for levies right now. Why? Because they will see some benefits of that next year. But then if the formula were to continue, it'll be reassessed. That new valuation will drive up the local dollars and drive down the state dollars, which puts you right back into. And I hear that all the time from community members. We just passed a levy. Why do you need more money? It's the way that mechanism is set up.
So then my second question is, and I don't know, obviously our legislators have a lot on their plate. So it's not just education that they're focused on. And it seems that maybe a lot of them don't understand how the funding actually works for public education. So my question is, are a group of educators or schools getting together to submit to the state a recommendation of how this could be better done, or we just leave it up to the legislators to figure that out?
So we are all both individually and collectively meeting with local legislators to demand, some changes, to ask them to educate them. That's really been my model is sitting down with them, of understanding, going through the numbers. It's hard to deny it when you see it on paper, when you see those pieces. From there, we're asking them to go back to the state and to try to advocate for change. We are taking people up to testify in front of the state house of those pieces, but ultimately, we haven't really been let in the room yet to help provide solutions to it. I have been asked by some of our local legislators in my recent, would I be willing to be a part of a state advocacy group? Would I be willing to be a part of the solution? I have no problem with that. I said, absolutely. I would love to have a seat at the table. And I think that's what we really need to see, is more collaboration with public schools, get public school superintendents and treasurers in the same room with our legislators, and let's figure this out because it matters that much.
Thank you.
For one, I'd really like to see a lot more vetting of these private institutions. Some sort of system. That way, if somebody is taking advantage, it becomes less profitable and less appealing. Maybe they move on to the next thing. But other than that, this is a great presentation, and thank you for the time.
Yeah, Mike, I agree with you, and we've been advocating for that, some accountability measures. I've not seen much come out of that. Even something about who's managing their money. I'm required by the Ohio Ethics Commission every year to open up my personal finances, to open up all of my assets, to ensure that I'm not siphoning off any public dollars. And that was put in front of the State Ethics Committee this year to ask of private schools, and it was shot down. So I think that's a very, that has been something we have been advocating for, because it was always the expectation. If you wanted public dollars, you had to follow public requirements. And now that has really stopped on the private side, but yet we are still penalized if we do not follow the state requirements.
Well, and to your point about penalization and the efforts and advocacy of like, hey, bringing this to light, for many of the schools that signed on to try to question the ed choice model, now there's legislation going through to stifle any questions that public schools can have, to minimize, and that will affect funding too if it goes through.
Correct. That would, because we are a part of that lawsuit. Mr. Callender, who entered that bill, has changed his stance a little bit on that, because I think he did receive a lot of feedback. The first rendition of the bill said any school district that was a part of the lawsuit, which many, there are over 300 school districts in that. He said that in the proposed bill, they would withhold all state funding. For us, that'd be $88 million a year. For somewhere like CPS, that's $125 million a year. Since I have heard there's been some movement in Columbus of they would just withhold the amount of dollars used to pay for the lawsuit, because it's $1.50 per kid. But still, that is our constitutional right. If we see something that does not follow the Constitution, then we need to fight for that. And what I don't want anyone to walk away from here is that I'm here pointing fingers. I'm here, I don't want education to be education should not be an R or a D issue. It should be a future issue. It should be making sure that we have one, I have no problem with school choice or allowing people to make the best decision for them. But we do need to have accountability, and we do need to have equal access. You can't tout that schools are spending so much money, but then the requirements put on us require us to provide such continuums of service and support the kids. And there are challenges. There's not to say that public schools don't have things that we have to work through, but I truly believe that all of those issues can be solved when we're at the table collaboratively, instead of finger pointing or trying to say our school system is broken.
What were the reasons given that private school accountability efforts were shot down?
I'm really not sure. I know that Senator Matt Huffman, who is the biggest proponent of school choice in the state of Ohio, he is also the senator majority, or in the Senate, he's the majority whip. He went to the Ohio Ethics Commission and just said that he thinks that will, it's just not a great idea. There was a lot of kind of bullying, intimidation to make that not go through, from my understanding. Obviously, I wasn't in the room to know all of the conversation, but just that he didn't think that it was right to do. And a lot of us scratch our heads because we do it every single year.
Hey, Andrea.
Yeah.
We have a question on Facebook Live from Marianne Halcomb. She said, what are the stats for open enrolling in Hamilton? Fairfield has disclosed that it's not costing their districts more money.
Yeah, so open enrollment is a unique concept. So if a child is in another public school, they can choose to open enroll into a public school if they're accepting. The hard part for districts is, you receive, as I talked about, base cost of a student is about $8,000 a year. I'm just going to use a round figure just so it's, easier to comprehend. If you are adding students from other districts to it, because I've had a lot of people say, well, just take them all. Understand you have to have a certain number to make that make sense. If a teacher's salary is $60,000, right? You take a few kids and you can plug them in, then that works out. However, the second that you add too many, now I have to hire another teacher and it is costing the district to it. So open enrollment is something that we use very conservatively because often, we get a number of families that want to open enroll special education kids. Well, special education is one of the very underfunded program here in the state of Ohio. And so if we don't have room in our units, unless we have a critical mass of being able to fund a whole nother unit, we can't take those open enrollments. So Fairfield is doing the right piece of making sure when they do that, we do the same thing. The only open enrollment we take is that we have room and the ability for it to actually save us a little money.
Okay, I guess we're about to wrap up. I just want to say, Andrea, thank you. And you may not think you're the local expert, but you sure seem like it to me. This has been an amazing presentation. And Tiffany, or who's wrapping this up?
I will do that, Dan.
Okay, thank you, Jason.
Absolutely, Andrea. Thank you so much. I was taking notes on all of this. Do you mind if I send a recap to everyone with a contact for you or someone from Hamilton?
Absolutely. If I could just add one additional thing, I've had a lot of people say, how can we help? What can we do? How can we advocate? I've actually shared with Dan, so I don't know if Dan, you'd be able to push that out, some talking points of what's happened in Hamilton, but then also just, who to reach out to, because I think this is going to take, when legislators hear from our community of how this is affecting them, tell your story, tell what's important to you, talk about the accountability piece, because that's when change happens. And so, Dan, if maybe you could attach that and push that out at that same time, I think that'd be great.
I love that. We will work on that. Everyone, I just want to thank you for spending the morning with us with our coffee and conversation. We do this every second Tuesday and fourth Tuesday of the month to provide insights and education for our business community. Coming up next with the Greater Hamilton Chamber of Commerce, tomorrow, February 25th, we are doing a soft relaunch of our Southern Ohio Young Professionals relaunch at Third Eye. Anyone 21 to 40, feel free to join us at 4:30 once again. Third Eye Brewing in Hamilton. February 27th, we are doing Build Back the Block event with Habitat for Humanity. You don't want to miss that. All of these are on our chamber calendar. On March 5th, we are partnering with Treasures of Ireland to provide an adventure-filled expedition for you and your team to travel to Ireland. So that is going to be March 5th. You don't want to miss that. 4:30 p.m. at Alexander's Market and Deli. On March 10th, we have our next coffee and conversation with the city of Hamilton, talking about Hamilton. The glow up continues. April 16th through the 18th, the City of Sculpture is presenting Hamilton Unfolded, which will feature paper-made activations and events to celebrate Hamilton's rich history around paper. If you would like to present at a coffee and conversation, feel free to reach out to us. We are always looking for educational and informative topics to discuss. Dan will be sending out information on how you can support our local school districts. Andrea, thank you again. We are so excited. Everyone have a wonderful day. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.